Come on, man.
Okay, then. I think we're ready to go. Yep. All right, everybody. Welcome to ThetaWave. Finally, we're able to get our podcast up and running. As you guys might notice here, we have an additional member of the camera family.
Yes, we've got 3 now.
We have Bob. We have what was
Dave.
Dave,
Mhm.
and now we've got Carl.
Carl,
Yeah,
welcome to the team, Carl. Happy you're here.
yeah.
Seriously. You mean a
I'm
lot
not,
to
but
us.
he is.
Yes. I love you, Carl. Not in a weird way or anything. Think about it.
Anyway, guys, welcome to ThetaWave Podcast. My name is Ryan Reed. I'm one of your hosts. I'm an AI engineer and a neuroscience enthusiast, as well as a musician and songwriter. And I'm here with my co-host, Jacob Holland, who is a neuroscience researcher. And Jacob, what have we got going on today?
All right. So, first, obviously, we're going to have our 1 hour of talking about some pretty fascinating stuff. I think we might dive a little bit into the nature of consciousness and life itself. I think that would be a very interesting topic to talk about. And then, obviously, in the second hour, we have phenylpyrrolitam. So, that's going to be what we're
Mm.
going to be talking about. All right. And its
So we're delving
cognitive
into the
effects.
race tan.
Yep. We're diving into the racetam family of nootropics.
Mm.
So, it's going to be a pretty good time. And then we're going to be talking about um, we're going to be talking about the gut brain axis. All right. So, your digestive tract, how it interacts with your brain, and how it can affect your emotions, and how that bi-directional relationship between what you eat and also what you think and what you feel can affect both simultaneously. And then we're going to end it off with, I think we're going to talk about gradient descents.
Gradient descent.
And so that's just the
We'll find out.
minimum. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm
We'll
saying
find
it
out
a
what
little
that
bit.
is.
And then
Yeah.
we might dive into tensors and
However, yeah, I was gonna
matrix
say,
multiplication.
all three of those, we for sure gonna go over gradient descent. We might go over tensors and matrix multiplication, like you said. But all three of those concepts are at the core and the heart of machine learning, of like what
Mm.
makes machine learning possible and work. So
That's gonna be pretty exciting to talk
they're
about.
important concepts to understand.
Especially for me because I've not yet done a deep dive into machine learning yet. And I really want to fully grasp what's at the foundations of it. So it'll definitely be beneficial for me. And if you're looking into getting into AI, I think that this podcast episode will be a pretty good one for you. Especially because, there's going to be a lot of very there's gonna be a lot of big opportunities for AI jobs in the future. So maybe this can be, a little help to get you an intuitive grasp on machine learning for the future. But yeah, so Ryan, I know you said you wanted to talk about consciousness and life. What's been on your mind recently
So,
about that?
yeah, I was just give me a second. I was checking our stream to make sure that that everything
Oh
was
yeah,
sounding okay. Because I don't want to get really far in here and then find out that nothing we did was
that's the
recorded.
worst. Remember that one like 2 hour podcast we
Mm-hmm.
recorded? And it was just
Mm-hmm.
nothing.
It was god awful.
It was
All
terrible.
right.
I remember for my YouTube, I recorded like a 45-minute episode and or just like a video from my YouTube, and none of the audio worked
Oh
because I
no.
forgot to switch something, just one little button I would have pressed, and it would have been
Oh,
fine. It was
that's
terrible.
the worst.
But we doing good?
Yeah, it looks like we're doing good.
Sweet. So life, consciousness.
Yeah. So I've just I don't know if you ever watch other people talk about things that ends up kind of aggravating or enraging you, like, while you're watching it because you're like, you wanna chip into the conversation
Yeah.
and say something, but you can't because you're not a part of you're not a part of it.
I mean, you can jump in, just be like, "Hey, you're wrong." Something like that.
Sure, I guess
"You're
that's
dumb."
also how you get, that's how
Try to get everyone to
internet
love you.
trolls. Um, but I keep on coming across questions regarding AI consciousness
Oh, yeah.
and people talking about our AI is conscious and like new research suggests that chat GBT-4 may be conscious or um and obviously you can tell by my tone that um
You don't think
I
ChatGPT
take
is conscious?
I take those those clickbaits as with a grain of salt. But and that's really kind of often what they are is clickbaits. But there is an overarching issue in question of will AIs become conscious? Are they conscious now? Will they be? Can they be? And a lot of that stems from the fact that we have not really, in a satisfying way, defined our terms.
Mhm.
And so I thought we could maybe chat about everything from consciousness itself and what we would define consciousness as. Maybe what's the difference between consciousness and intelligence, if there is, if there is a difference there, and then what's the difference between consciousness and life, and what constitutes something that is conscious versus
Mhm.
something that is alive, and maybe try and come up with a sensible definition that works for our purposes so that we can then delve into things like qualifying whether or not AIs are considered conscious. And it looks like for some odd reason our new director
On?
is well, he just decided he wanted to do his own thing.
That is interesting. Oh, wait, it's looking the wrong direction?
Follow me.
Bruh. Come on, Carl. We just hired you.
Freaking Carl. I think we're gonna have to
Okay,
fire him.
so one thing about consciousness, right? It's so mysterious in essence, but at the same time, it's what you could consider the singularity or the beginning of everything else we could infer from. And so a lot of people take that and they say, well, it's not consciousness that's emergent, it's everything else that comes out of it. Everything is a derivative of consciousness because that's all we can really know from what we perceive, because that is the essence of our perception, is consciousness, what the information we receive. And then there's the question of, well, is the information we receive different than the information that's actually out there? And if there's some sort of connection between the underlying essence of that information and the information we receive, and if that could cultivate and create what we experience as subjectivity, pretty much. And so you have the people who are saying, well, consciousness is fundamental and we can derive everything else out of it. It's really nice. We don't have to deal with the hard problem of consciousness. Let's just take consciousness as an axiom. And it's like, well, you have to think about how often it is that we perceive or find things that are conscious or show signs of consciousness. And if you look at it, it's a very, very small number. There's very specific patterns in which organisms can arise. And so maybe there's something intrinsic and fundamental to the pattern that then can give rise to emergent consciousness. But it's hard to say if that's what's underlying everything. Does it make
I
sense for that to be that way?
I think we need to take a step back, like before discussing anything like that of emergent properties or things like that. Like we're still using the term consciousness, which has not yet been defined.
Mhm.
So I think we need to come up with a definition for consciousness and a definition. We need to define. There's three things that we probably should discuss and differentiate in order to determine if there even is a difference and what that difference is. One
Mhm.
is life, as much as we can without going weeks on the same topic.
Yeah.
Then two, consciousness, and then three, self awareness, and whether or not consciousness and self awareness are two separate things or they're the same. Um, and so, start off with life. I would suggest to use the famous words from the song. Simplest definition of life I can think of is anything with the will to survive.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
anything that has a will to survive would constitute life, in my opinion. And that will can take various shapes. Like bees, we would consider alive, and they seem to have a will to survive and to propagate. Um, Even flowers and plants, they seem to have some sort of, even on a minuscule scale. Now, I don't know enough to be able to speak to the mechanics of that, but from my understanding, they have a designed component within them that allows them to try and survive in some
Mhm.
form or another, you know?
And you could kind of take it a step further and saying, instead of saying whatever has a will to survive, you could even say the will to persist, to resist high entropy states,
So survive.
survive. Yes. And then you kind of have to define the terms as to how the correlation between the will to survive and persist and maintain your system of functions is what's equal to the innate awareness of that system.
Exactly. And that's the key kind of transition point from there is that just because under that definition it would assert that a lot of things are alive, such as plants and and you know because they seem to have that
Hmm.
will to survive, not will as in conscious will, but the mechanic
Well,
to
I
survive.
mean, they can communicate, they
Um,
release neurotransmitters, they have some sort of pain receptors as
yeah,
well. So that it
yeah,
raises an
yeah. It
interesting
is.
point.
That's
It's
good point. But then I said I don't intend it to mean conscious because I haven't defined consciousness yet.
mhm,
Um, and so that kind of leads to a good transition point there to conscious. And okay, so like a lot of things. anything that kind of propagates and tries to stay around, in some way or another is would be considered alive. But are those things conscious? And what is the difference there? And that's kind of, I think, where a lot of the problems arise because of our lack of refinement of that term.
Mhm.
And I would assert personally that consciousness and self-awareness are the same thing. If we There's no need for a definition unless it is going to be that. Because like you said, things like things that are alive, such as flowers and plants, can still have networks and components and transmitters and skills and things, but there is a very different nature to something like
Mhm.
plants as opposed to animals. And what is that difference, there? And that's where that term, I think, becomes necessary to create and then define
Mhm.
what's that exact difference. And I would say, based off of my knowledge, which, I'll admit biology is not my area, but neuroscience and machine learning are, and based off of my knowledge of those things, it seems to me that consciousness could be defined as self-awareness, like
Mhm.
the self-referential state in which you are able to perceive your own actions and how they're impacting you,
Yeah.
and the actions of others and how they're impacting you. And now some people might resist that because they would think, they would ask, well, are you saying that ants are conscious? Like, yes, that is exactly what I'm saying.
Mhm.
Ants are conscious, just a lower level of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. There's a it's interesting because a lot of people will kind of mesh in together awareness in and of itself and the viewpoint from the subjective agent's perspective. And I think we need to realize that awareness and the understanding of what your functionality is and how to use that to navigate the world is implicit within all organisms. And then when you have a higher form of complexity and integration within a more resourceful system, you have the energy to spend to actually then begin the exponential self referencing process that humans could have. Thus, why we have a more integrative and more clear ego than that of an ant, you know?
Mm, yeah. The people, I think we tend to like to think there's something special about us, something that makes us unique above everything else, and thus gives us the right to do things like experiment on animals and whatnot. And while I'm not personally one that would assert there's anything wrong with that, I think that's kind of an acrobatic form of justification,
Mhm.
rather than just being like, I'm bigger, stronger, and smarter.
Yeah.
Therefore, sorry, you know.
Mhm. Could you turn up the air a little bit? Because I'm getting really cold. I'm like shivering. It's all good. You know, I think people are resistant to letting their leading moral compass be a more power centric hierarchy as opposed to like something that's more nice.
Mhm.
And I think that saying we're different and we're above them and giving us kind of that authority of something implicit within how things should work instead of, just doing it how it is, we kind of use it as like a justification to continue living the way we want to,
Yeah.
whether that's, from a religious standpoint or maybe you think just you yourself are better than everyone else. Maybe you're a narcissist. Both of those can be used in that. So,
Yeah. And I think that that self-referential state is something that allows us to make rapid progress and kind of develop our own evolution, so to speak, control
yeah.
that process to an extent. And we see even animals attempt to do similar things. It's the ability to control your environment to be better suited for your
Yeah.
existence. And that kind of is an indicator that of that self referential processing, um, when that being is able to motivate itself to try and change its environment, you know, um, which is interesting. But I think that actually, before we hit that topic, let's also,
We haven't defined consciousness yet.
yeah, we have,
We have?
yeah, it's your
Okay.
self-referential state.
Self referential
Yeah.
state. Okay.
So when basically your knowledge of self and what self is doing
Hmm.
and how your actions and other people's actions are impacting you, and your ability to um, use that data in some meaningful way towards your thing that makes you alive, which is your survival.
Now, how would you feel about the definition of consciousness being the system's innate awareness to its own functionality? How would you feel
I'm
about that
just,
definition?
I guess my question would be, how does that differ from the way that it was previously stated?
It differs in the sense that it kind of helps us have a good distinction between highly complex integrated self-referential processing that we as a human have versus the very simple navigational aspects of like a very small organism, for
I
example.
don't think that a line can be drawn. I don't think that
Maybe
there.
not a line, but a gradient of sorts, that kind of a gradient of implicit awareness that then has different threshold levels of innate complexity that give rise to
See,
self-referential processing.
a
Like
threshold, though, by nature implies a line, and I don't know how that would be
uh,
determined.
I would say that you're right. That is something very hard to determine, but I think it's somewhere we should go because if we did have
Why?
uh,
Why can't it exist as a gradient?
what can exist as a gradient?
Like, why can't it just exist as a gradient? Like,
Well, there can be a gradient that has different thresholds that then give rise to different levels of complex functions like self-referential processing. But
so
that awareness is
okay,
implicit within the system.
I think I see where you're going with this, and that okay, well, I think that's beyond what the definition of consciousness needs to be. I think that keeping consciousness as that gradient um, is a important structure for understanding our cohesiveness with other similar beings and not establishing a trying to establish a hard and fast line,
Yeah.
because I don't think that it's accurate. Once we allow, like, by our definitions, once we allow for a line to be drawn, people are going to draw the line. And um, so I think having consciousness defined as this gradient, is would help encourage that perception of it.
Mhm.
Now, if you wanted to further extend that out to be like, okay, so along this gradient of consciousness, as beings develop in consciousness in their conscious. Okay, so having consciousness defined as the base self-referential awareness, right?
Mhm.
So when you combine consciousness with intelligence, which is where you get the gradient from. So you have your base, like, referential, your self-referential state, and then you have your intelligence level, which kind of forms this line. And when you combine those two things together, they can give you kind of what we they can give you a way to measure
Mhm.
the level of awareness
Mhm.
that a being has. And right now, as far as we know, on that scale, we are kind of at the top of the intelligence
Mhm.
chain there. And so well, some of us are. Um,
Some of us.
but being at the top, being at the top of uh, that chain kind of allows us to evaluate the mechanics of everyone
Mhm.
else below us, and like the things that kind of make us different and make us unique from
Yeah.
them. And I think that's where kind of maybe determining, okay, in general, when you combine that self-referential state with different intelligence factors, like where does that tend to happen
Yeah.
in the evolutionary process? Like,
Mhm.
for instance, there is a lot of, and I just realized, I don't know to what extent animals actually have emotions, but determining, like, their emotional processing capabilities,
Mhm.
and whether how raw whatever emotions that are generated, how raw those emotions are versus how much they have the capability of processing them. And because there are our emotional processing centers are something that kind of have developed a somewhat long way.
Yeah.
And other things like that seem to be particularly developed in our brains, and some of the abilities that arise out of that development. I
Mhm.
think that's maybe where you could draw some thresholds.
Yeah, and I guess I was like you said with intelligence, you can really kind of draw that kind of uh gradient there. And I would say, well, what is intelligence except for more complex adaptive networks
Well,
in the
more
brain?
ability to
Yeah.
process your self-referential
Mhm.
state and your sensory information.
So you're saying something like a rodent would have low levels or a low level self-referential state.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, exactly. Like, it would have a it's kind of a yin and a yang almost there with the intelligence and self-referential state. The the greater your intelligence, the more it allows you to process self and your place in the universe. And the more you process your place in the universe, the greater increases your self-referential state. And so it kind of almost like is this loop that allows us to build. That's why you see some humans that have very wildly different levels of both understanding of self and intelligence than others. There are some humans that spend a lot of time attempting to understand their own mechanics and why they do what they do,
Yeah.
and the things that make them them, and then put that understanding to a useful application and process it through their cognitive networks, their cortex and whatnot,
Yeah.
um, and then use that new understanding to further kind of refine that understanding of self. And so I think we tend to develop both of those things together. And so I would say yes, there's probably a level of both intelligence and self-referential understanding in rats.
Mhm.
They can understand what they're doing, where they are. If they're hungry, they know they're hungry.
Mhm.
They have that. Even if it is it might not be something we could even particularly imagine what it would be like from their perspective,
Yeah.
but they do understand. It's like almost a very blurred image.
Mhm.
If you like take a very crisp and clear image of something, and then you blur it and blur it and blur it and blur it, like maybe that's their
Yeah.
version of understanding of self, you
Mhm.
know?
Or maybe it's very clear and definitive, but only in relation to their where they are evolutionarily speaking, you know? And that actually brings up a really interesting question because as you keep going down and down the scale of complex organisms and you get to a single celled organism, you can say, well, is that system currently rudimentary? And if it is, does it have that potentially even like very simple awareness of its states? And if that's the case, well, can we go even further to the parts of that single celled organisms? And what's their functionality? If we keep going smaller and smaller, it's it's what interests me is finding the underlying building blocks that give rise to consciousness in specific patterns of organization within the universe, like on Earth, for example, you know? And what I see is that with this self-referentialing model, you could go down to the lowest possible forms of life and infer extremely low levels of self-referential processing. You can even go below that to where you get simple, like almost 1 0 binary states that they could potentially interact with.
Maybe.
And from there, you'd say, well, are they aware of those binary states that they can exist in? And it might have an extremely low level of self-referential processing, extremely low, but it's there in the first place. And if those are the same fundamental building blocks that build up the rest of the universe, who's to say that those particles are not aware of those states? You
Yeah, I
know?
can see where you're going with that. I don't know how that would hold up actually in when picked apart by the actual mechanics of things.
Yeah.
I
But
I
it's
don't really
a
have
good
enough
thought
understanding
experiment.
of particle physics to be able to speak to any of that, but
Yeah. It's hard because it you can say that there is an invisible dinosaur in an electron and that it doesn't affect the states. It's just there.
At the center of every
And
black hole is a small man with a flashlight looking for a circuit breaker.
exactly. And it's like, sure, we can't prove that to be wrong, but does it actually give rise to predictions about anything in reality? No, it's useless. We don't need it a part of our theory until we observe it for ourselves.
Mhm.
And with something like this, you have to be very careful because you can infer consciousness on just about anything and get away with it at this point.
Mm.
But is there a use for it? I would say that there would have to be some pretty crazy there would you would have to get to what underlies rudimentary consciousness.
And that's well, I mean, that's where I was, kind of a attempting to explain the observations that would be an outcropping of that, where the what we see as an outcropping of seemingly that self-referential state is a ability to change your environment and yourself in order to better suit your survival needs.
Mhm.
And so I would ask the question, if you're trying to infer consciousness on something that's fundamental, does that thing have built within it the capability of of changing its environment for the sake of its survival? If the answer is no, I'm not asking can it change its environment? Because anything in the physical world has the capability of changing its environment. I'm asking if its survival instinct can motivate it based off of its current understanding of its place in the environment to change the environment. And if the answer is yes, then I would say yes, that thing probably just demonstrates a low level consciousness.
Mhm.
If the answer is I don't know or no, then that the kind of it should probably default to no in that instance, for now until more evidence would
Yeah.
suggest otherwise.
I would with what I currently know, I would lean towards yes. And that
Lean towards
is
yes, what?
yes, that it still stands, that consciousness by that standard could be inferred on every fundamental part of reality. And my reasoning for that, and this still goes along with what I was saying earlier, it's like something kind of useless to invoke unless it brings about predictions. But I think what might, from what I can see, predict it is the precursor to the environmental conditions necessary for life. Because you have autopoiesis, right? That's a necessary condition system that's capable of maintaining itself by creating its own parts. That's something that has to be accessible. The the natural laws have to actually work together to then have a sustainable way of maintaining or resisting free energy, so like entropy as well. All of these things are working in conjunction to create life or what we know as it. And the key, I
Your
think,
camera's frozen.
oh, my camera's, oh, shoot, it is frozen. Dang it. What should I do? Should I just turn off my camera and turn it back on again?
Yeah, try switching it and
Come on, come on. Ah, now it's on disable video. Dang it.
um,
Can I?
I will log into my
It's like I need to reset it again. Dang it, I can't believe this happened again. It's so annoying. Hey, at least they can see me on the big one right there. So hey,
yeah.
still here. But
Let me try log in here to my computer real fast so that I can manage our settings once you reconnect.
uh, restart it. Come on, yeah, no need to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not yet. There I am.
Settings here.
Change it back. No auto gain.
Okay. I think we should be test, test, test. Test your mic.
Set 1, 2, 3.
Are you using the right one?
You and me. Yes.
Alrighty.
We're back.
Anyway,
Hey,
hold on a
you
second.
good?
Let me double check our stream, make sure that
Good. Hurry up. Hurry up.
yeah, we're good. Okay. Anyway,
So, as I was saying, to sum it all up, I think that the natural laws working in conjunction with the specific environmental pressures necessary for complex life unlock a hidden condition that brings about the emergent complexity that's possible with consciousness, but not necessarily consciousness at its fundamental level.
I think I understand why you're going where you're going, but I think I would disagree, and
Yeah, it's
it's
up in the air.
there's an I would say cells and maybe cells and viruses and whatnot demonstrate certain level of consciousness. But I think that the to infer that on other things without a reason is a bit it's extrapolate unnecessary extrapolation that serves no purpose and goes against the reason for defining like consciousness at all. And so if there is a specific mechanic to that thing that suggests that not only is it trying to keep itself around and propagate, but it's that is also causing it to try and change its environment.
Mhm.
That would be an indicator that there's some sort of self-referential awareness going on. And but for most things out in the universe, to our knowledge, there aren't there for most things there aren't that mechanic involved
Mhm.
of the what we would consider life, that desire to live, propagate, survive, combined with that consciousness, that self-referential awareness that right gives outcropping and rise to the will to change your environment, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and that's why I think I would disagree there that and say that I don't think you can just randomly assign consciousness and be like, "Oh, you can't prove me wrong." It's like, "Yes, I can because you can't prove you right."
Yeah.
Like, that's the whole reason for having a definition for consciousness there is so that you have to prove through your observations and data that that lives up, you know, to that standard.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of woo woo surrounding consciousness because of how little is known about it. And so there's a lot of
How little has been defined about it. Yeah.
defined about it. Yeah. And just because, the the reason why it's such a hard problem is because you can't go beyond your own conscious experience. So how can you know what is being implicitly experienced within another organism, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of room for very abstract notions about what it is. But for me, I I'm okay with exploring this idea that everything is conscious because what I would say is that, well, that's true. We can't randomly assign consciousness to everything in the physical universe. That doesn't make sense. And I would say, well, I think it's true by association. So you would have something like a single-celled organism that gives off a very small, low-level property of consciousness, right? It's the integrated information of that system working, right? In conjunction with each other. And then you have subsystems, right? That would be also used to then have that intrinsic integrated information. And so as you get smaller and smaller, you have lower level systems working to then emerge this more complex version of it.
That's a logical fallacy though. Like
Oh,
that is um
well, maybe I
assuming
said that wrong.
assuming that is like saying that um that all um because some hot tubs are jacuzzis, all hot tubs must have jacuzzi in it. It doesn't
Kind of.
it doesn't work because the just because it has the components, some of the components that make up this functionality that we're describing doesn't mean that it has that functionality.
I guess so. I mean, if we can define the specific parts that then outline the self-referential processing, then from there we could then extrapolate and go deeper into that. But
For real, dude?
oh no, why does it keep trying to track you? Dang it.
Anyway, go ahead.
But uh, the well, I'm trying to remember exactly where I was. If we can outline the parts that are exhibiting this property of self-referential processing, then great, we can go with that and then examine those functions and see kind of even a deeper, more intrinsic outline. But to my understanding, you can only see its functionality exhibiting this as a whole. And so the smaller holes you have that are making up the system, the more you go into them, they might just be exhibiting an even lower amount of this self referential processing. And so it's not necessarily, I'm trying not to make it sound like, oh, well, if if I'm conscious, everything must be conscious. It's more so just, okay, how far theoretically are we willing to take it?
Right, but that's why we use definitions like that to describe a observation and or a mechanic underlying an observation, if that's known.
Mhm.
But you're moving when you start breaking things, trying to break things down that small without the observation included,
Yeah.
it becomes first off an element of why. Why would you do that? Because that serves no useful purpose. Second, it completely defeats the purpose of a definition. Like it the you're going down to the point of, well, because this is part of this, why not call this that too? Like this can be, this could be that, like, and it's a, at what point do you stop seeing the observation?
Yeah.
And so, you know, for consciousness, as we kind of defined it, there were two components there. One, that it needed to qualify the life qualifier,
Mhm.
which was that it had to have that drive, that will to survive. And then two, it needed to be able to understand itself in a way that allowed it to change its environment in order to help achieve that will to survive,
Mhm.
or that end goal to survive. Um, and so it's that loop, that self-referential processing that we were talking about. And so the observational outcropping of that is an organism changing its environment in order to better suit it.
Mhm.
And so if that observation is not there, there's no purpose in drawing a like a conclusion about its consciousness.
Yeah.
Um, and now that's not to say that that is, the only mechanic that makes us us, or that, that we are the creme de la creme of that mechanic. There,
We are, of course.
right?
But
There could be, other aliens out there, or things that we wouldn't even know to look for, that could have a far greater ability to, or maybe even just a longer evolved
Mhm.
version of that self-referential
More
processing loop.
efficiently evolved as
Yeah, and they
well.
could have be able to take in more information,
Mhm.
and that could further enhance that in a way that, that we couldn't really achieve with our current biology. But so, like, it's not, saying any of that. It's simply a kind of a way to quantify what is the difference between the life qualifier and what we are, and one of those, describing one of those differences. And what's the difference between me and a flower? Like, they clearly we've displayed very different behaviors, and and both of us are alive, so we both meet that criteria. But there's a even a huge difference between a rat and a flower.
Mhm.
And so there is seems to be an underlying mechanic that is giving rise to different behavior, and it's a behavioral set that we see across species.
Yeah.
And so I think consciousness is an attempt to quantify that difference.
Mm.
And um, so if we're willing to operate under that definition for now, um, of the scale of consciousness and intelligence, um, and intelligence, I guess, just being your ability to process
Mhm.
your own referential awareness in an environment and make use of it. Um, then that then allows us to have a platform to begin to answer the question or questions like it of, is AI conscious? Is it not? Is
Yeah.
ChatGPT conscious? Is it not? And so does that definition work for moving forward? Or
Yeah, I guess I would say so. I mean, like for me, I'm not exactly like a panpsychist or anything, but I like to dabble around with the idea because I like that definition. I think it's good. I I will say I don't think there's anything different from obviously there are different aspects of our functionality, but I don't really think there's intrinsically anything different than us like a chair would be. We're still made up of the same fundamental properties,
I
right?
would agree with that on a meta scale, like, I mean, on a like a micro, sorry, a
Oh yeah, on just
molecular,
like a
like
mhm,
quantum scale, like, sure, yeah, there's not a whole lot of real differences. I think on a meta scale and in the reality that we live and have to operate, then yes, there is a huge difference,
yeah,
and that is
obviously the symbolic nature of a chair versus you is different to us.
right, and that is kind of the one of the purposes of creating definitions like that of consciousness and of the world around us and rules for observations and
Mhm.
whatnot, things that can be predicted. And
Yeah.
it's for better operating, describing, and predicting the world and environment in which we live. We don't live on a
Yeah.
quantum scale. If we did, then
Life would look a little
all of this
different.
would be meaningless. Like,
Or maybe we'd see the true meaning in all of this.
we would just have a different vantage point and references, like
Yeah.
the and so but so I mean, if you wanted to, as a thought experiment, kind of figure out what your relation to the world and things would be if you did live on that scale, then
Yeah, it doesn't really
but
matter.
but for the purposes of the practical life and living, um the I think that the buck has to stop at an observation, um, for definitions for
Yeah.
for us. And so um, that's if that definition of consciousness is accepted by whoever it is that is listening to to this, um, then that allows us to move on to answer the question. If they don't accept it, there's not much we
Yeah.
can do about that, because they're going to have to define for themselves what they think consciousness even is. I mean, like, there can be a universal definition that would be defined by a science committee, and there'd still be people that would
Yeah.
define
Right.
it differently.
And there are probably even other scientists who would define it differently.
Hmm.
Like there are so many different theories out there. It
but
truly is
it's
phenomenal.
a matter of creating one that you can prove
Mhm.
and creating an observation, like basically creating a definition for describing an observation, its functionality in a way that can be repeated and and has not been able to be shown
Mhm.
to be uh true, you know.
Yeah.
And so if we're operating under that definition of consciousness, no. To answer the question, are AIs, any AIs, alive? The answer is no. First off, they don't qualify, or sorry, conscious. Are any AIs conscious? First off, they don't qualify the self-referential processing yet.
Mhm.
We have not developed that awareness, into AIs yet. That's not to say it couldn't ever happen, but it hasn't, and that's not something that's innate to um, models like ChatGPT or anything, for sure.
Mhm.
And then it doesn't qualify that primary one, which is um, that it has to have the will to survive. You know, um, and that kind of fundamental will to survive is the one of the key components there because it motivates
Mhm.
the processing of the self-referential awareness
Yeah.
and behavior that's then observed from then on out.
And I think it's totally possible that we will get to that point, especially because it can happen within the natural order of the
Mhm.
universe. It can also happen with, you know, our pressurizing and fixing it to get to that, to get to the conditions necessary for something that would be equivalent to consciousness, right?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's absurd at all to consider the possibility of that happening, merging eventually. It's actually one of the reasons I'm so interested in AI
Yeah.
and neuroscience. It's kind of a merging of curiosity about human consciousness and a desire to try and replicate it, you know,
Yeah.
and not to scare anybody out there, but but that study is kind of one of the things that is constantly intriguing me and like is kind of pulling me more into the field. Um,
Mhm.
and that's one of the reasons why I kind of am. That's one of the reasons why my specialization areas, or at least one of them, is in the reinforcement learning,
Mhm.
is because that is that reinforcement loop, the driving of the actions, um, and and the information to action, is a key component to
Mhm.
who we are and how we operate. And it's one piece of the puzzle. It's not a full solution or replication in any way, shape, or form, but the it's a piece of the puzzle, and it's one that I find particularly fascinating as well as underdeveloped.
I mean, one of something that we could talk about is the temporal understanding of consciousness, right? Because you are not conscious now of yesterday, or you're not conscious of the future. It's very much situated in the present moment, right? It's like I think the standard is like your one conscious experience is like around like 3 seconds. I think that's what it is. This 3 seconds is kind of like the integrated burst of your thalamus that then like continues through that pattern.
Sure. Yeah, I guess we could. it depends on how whether you want to include all the information that goes into that processing,
Mhm.
for that self-referential state.
Yeah.
And I would say you're, the space element, like you're 100% right. Like, for us as humans, consciousness takes on a more advanced form because of the cognitive abilities that we have. Like we have
Mhm.
both a lot of different types of memory um, that are stored within the hippocampus. Like we've got our not only our sequential and temporal memory, but we have our classificational and referential memories
Yeah.
and working memory and all this other stuff. And uh, so we have a lot more kind of evolved information storage, so to speak, capacity. But in addition to that, we have, and that kind of takes like care of like the historical side of the expansion of our conscious
Mhm.
existence. But we also have cognitive projections. That's the ability of our brain to project realistic scenarios for the future
Mhm.
and try to make determine actions
Yeah.
that will bring about specific outcomes in that
Mhm.
future.
Yeah.
So it really is like kind of whether you want to include all of the evolved processing that makes up our version of consciousness, our kind of expanded version of it,
Mhm.
um, or you want to talk about on this base element, because I'd say on this base element, like consciousness would probably be have to be confined to in order to describe it on a base level, you'd have to confine it to a single time frame
Yeah.
um, sampling. So like a oof, single sample to time frame,
Mhm.
and but as that evolves and the actions that you take, affect your organism or yourself or your environment around you, you're you can expand out that kind of definition of what
Mhm.
is involved in that conscious process to be something all the way to at least what we know as consciousness, which
Mhm.
is a both a large historical context and a projected future context.
Yeah. So it's kind of like the kind of the I like to think of it as like the pressure between our past predictions and what they received and how they interpret the data, and then our future predictions to come.
Hmm.
And that pressure is what creates our conscious experience that's in the moment.
Yeah, and the likelihood. I was doing it to you.
Shoot. Ah, dang it. Moving by itself. No. All right. Follow my dreams.
Um,
Okay, move mine back.
hmm? That was yours. My bad. I thought that was mine.
No, you good.
I'm gonna turn it back on again. You can do that if you want. Um,
What were we saying? Talking
the context windows and of
about.
of memory and
Right.
um how they play a part in our conscious experience. The historical information that we have to pull from is a huge part of what shapes our future predictions. And so without that historical context, it would just be like a random, we might get it, we might not, you know?
Mhm.
And so that increased historical capacity almost results in that expanded future cognitive projection ability.
Mhm.
So it's kind of, I wonder if that arose as an outcropping of increased memory.
Increased memory causing an increase in consciousness.
Well, causing an increase in conscious future projections.
Mhm.
So, like, what will the likely result of this scenario or this action be?
Oh, that's actually very interesting. That expands on kind of what we said earlier pretty nicely
Hmm.
because it introduces how we get this goal orientedness in our lives. It kind of brings it down
Hmm.
to its intrinsic level, which is actually pretty important, I think, for people to understand, right?
And that's that
Its usability in the world.
basal ganglia too that helps with the refinement
Mhm.
of that those processes, that goal
Yeah.
oriented process of, given the current goal presented to me by the cortex and the historical information, the hippocampus, and my current state, and not in that process, I believe this is the best outcome,
Yeah.
for us.
Mhm.
And if that it goes through that process of taking an action or receiving more information, whether that be taking a step or receiving more information, it's that loop that ends up coming back around, and um and either reinforces that belief
Mhm.
or transitions it to a different prediction.
Yeah. And I think that actually might be where the will to live aspect of organisms exists is, or at least our more complex ones. It's the striving towards those goals that then,
Consciousness.
yes, that then give rise to the need for more experiences that feeds our data sets that then integrate back into the world. And, we gather more resources because of it to further this process of getting better and better at navigating the complexity of reality.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it doesn't. I think that that's not the exactly the survival instinct itself, but it is
Mhm.
the outcropping of the survival
Yeah.
instinct and that conscious process
Mhm.
there. It's that observation, uh, processing, and then goal for the sake of enhanced survival, and then outcome observation,
It's like
processing, goal.
what's the need for consciousness from an evolutionary perspective? To be aware if
Able
you're
to
alive or not.
navigate the environment that you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
That's absolutely necessary for that process to happen. It's one of the first things I would do if I was a rudimentary system trying to emerge more
that
complex
assumes consciousness of that rudimentary system already, but that's
the
one of the first things I would
rudi
do if I didn't have a consciousness, would
Would
be
be
to
getting
create a
consciousness.
consciousness. But you
It
need a consciousness in order to make that decision, which is one of those interesting elements that's like, okay, how
how
what
low do you
what
go?
process, what random like sequence of genetic events or whatever happened to that created that ability to now start that loop of of observation, reaction.
There is this theory that suggests that consciousness is not in everything, but is trying to emerge out of everything. And so
Mhm.
once you
I
have
would
the
agree with that.
natural and environmental conditions necessary for it, it will emerge naturally because it's
If it's live, I would say
fundamental.
yes, that is the
Yeah.
case. Like if it has life,
Mhm.
it
Those
it
the conditions for life would be the conditions for that.
yeah. So if it has life, if it is alive, then it will given the option, it will always choose consciousness
Mhm.
because consciousness is a huge aid in that process,
Definitely.
that ability to kind of reference in yourself and your state and what your the outcomes of your actions and whatnot. And the I think the human ego kind of sees our place as at in our observed world as the most evolved in that process, and that's probably
Mhm.
the reason why we kind of have almost that supremacy
Yeah.
mentality of we're better than everything else around us.
It's good for survival to be
It
better than
is,
everything else,
and
you know?
it part of that, is an accurate observation that in many ways we are
Yeah, we came out dominant.
better.
Good for us,
Mhm.
you know?
That doesn't mean that, but I think that kind of that difference there and that dominance has led to some more unhelpful things like the idea that we somehow have a soul and like the which is if people want to hypothesize about that and consider the possibility, like I'm all for considering possibilities, but to believe it without reason, like an
Mhm.
actual observation to back that up, like to me it just doesn't make any logical sense. And there's no reason to suspect that a soul is any different in its essence from conscious, what we've been defining as consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think that there's that need to kind of feel like we're special, feel like maybe a part of us will survive
Mhm.
beyond our own death. And um and in a way it will. You're not going away, you're just changing forms,
Yep.
you know?
The
It-
consciousness of those of your decaying body will exist forever,
I
I
mean,
would
yeah,
say.
you're what is the saying? Energy is never created or lost, it's merely transferred.
Yeah, exactly. You're just transferring your energy to a more fundamental source. You can call that heaven if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I'd s- probably assure you you have less worries as dirt
that's for sure.
than you will as a human. So that sounds kind of heavenly.
Mhm. I kinda want a more primary experience. That's what I'm thinking.
What does
And,
that mean?
like a more just simple one, you know? It's kinda nice, I would think. Not really having to worry about anything, but
Hmm.
just being a
Speck
floating
of dust.
system of nothingness, pretty much, that
Just
has
a
awareness.
photon. A photon. Just
Dude, imagine being a photon. You don't have to worry about nothing
it's like Buzz
except just
Lightyear, like
going forward.
flying through
Exactly.
space.
That sounds like a wonderful experience to me, dude.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm gonna say, especially if you're just, like, traveling through space for hundreds of billions of years, just at the speed of light, just getting to observe everything.
You know what's crazy to me? The life of a photon leads. Literally, it in the blink of like an eye, it instantly created and then is dead. Like it's it because of the mechanics of time. That's what
It's
happens.
weird. It's weird stuff.
Like that's nutty for us. That is a long period of time.
But to the photon,
But
it's
to the
nothing.
photon, it just is live, it's dead.
Mhm.
You know, if you were living within the photon's plane of existence,
That's
you would not
true.
even have a life. It would just be a live dead.
Yeah. Which is actually interesting to see if we can get to the point to slowing down light to a drastic degree, how that would interact with the world, you know? Because we've been able to slow it down a little bit, not by very
How
much.
much have we been able to slow it down?
I forget the woman who did it. Her face is in my mind, but pretty much it was by like 0.00217 uh
Any numbers past that are kind of virtually meaningless.
yeah, pretty much. So around like they just lessened it to that
Yeah.
distance kilometer per kilometer of
Wow.
speed of light traveled. So but they were able to do it. And so if you're able to do that more and more and more, I just wonder how that interaction with the photon would go about. You know? I mean, we're not there technologically at all, but could be interesting. Imagine it's like a photon just
That's like one of those kind of like yeah, just like as it
yeah,
to wave it as it passed by.
that'd be weird, but also pretty cool.
It's one of those kind of for me, you know how you were saying earlier, like that was what was it you were saying? It was something that you could uh not really one of those crazy things about the universe that you couldn't really
Oh, yeah, where it's like at least one of these crazy conspiracy theories have to be true
um
about the
for me,
universe.
that's the craziest one of the craziest things to consider about the universe is the nature of time
Yeah, that is a weird one.
and how it changes
Mhm.
and its integration with the rest of the universe.
Yeah,
Like there seems to be an integration with gravity and space. And somehow those all affect time. It's weird.
it is strange. It's like almost like from a conscious perspective, it's almost stretching or compacting the information flow that you receive
Yeah, yeah. It's a
by bending space-time.
kind of like you're like almost on a zip line or something like that with like little bumps and dong dong dong. Like
Yeah,
every
pretty
little
much.
bump that you hit is like a moment that you experience and like pressing or like expanding those like those kind of moments um resulting in a longer or shorter plane of existence, which is like, well, if that can be done, like if you can
Yeah,
expand or shrink your plane of existence, what even is existence?
yeah. You know, there's
Like,
the
could you extend your life to the end of the universe? Like,
I mean, that goes back to, like, the depth of time and then to the nature of it. Because if you can experience a moment's infinite depth, then you could potentially live in that moment forever.
I wonder if time it
Wouldn't have to leave.
I wonder if time is a byproduct of the expanding space that we're in.
It's totally possible,
Like, a byproduct
as
of
well
the
as the
fact that, like, you have maybe gravity and space kind of intertwined, and then you explode this thing out, and as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that's a in within a f I could mention imagine within a four-dimensional time or four-dimensional frame or more that could have the effect of creating another, um, plane of existence, so to speak.
I would say so. It's interesting, right? Because we have like the four fundamental forces, right? We got electromagnetic, we got strong, weak nuclear force, then we have gravity, which is just a completely different
And
category
it
than the
doesn't
other
it's one
three.
of those things that people often leave off of their calculations because they just can't figure out how to integrate it, you know?
Yeah, because there is no graviton.
It
It's
seems very separate from
mhm,
everything else, you
yeah,
know? And it's almost like to me, it seems like it's almost like an outcropping of a some sort of dimensional effect that we don't understand.
mhm,
Like there's something happening either that we just don't have the ability to perceive yet, or in another dimension
yeah,
that is causing an effect that happens within the dimensions that we exist in, that we are able to observe, but we can't
yeah,
observe the actual thing
mhm.
itself. And so that's why it doesn't fit with anything, is because
There's no place to put it within our perception
right. It's
where it
like we
could
can't
exist.
how do you
Yeah,
define something that you can't, or like how do you predict something and describe something that you can't see, you can only see the effect of
yeah,
it's like a three-dimensional person s- putting a hole through a two-dimensional being's piece of paper.
mhm,
How would they even know to describe what was happening on in the third dimension? They could only describe the effect that they saw, which was that there's a part of their existence that they can't interact with or move past, you know? It's like this weird kind of thing. It's like the one-dimensional being would have to go around it, you know?
mhm.
Or the two-dimensional being would have to go around it.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, the holographic principle, right? Everything within a black hole, which is just warped to the extreme amount of gravity, right?
Mhm.
And in space time. So it's an extreme warpage of that that then gives rise to this, mass eating monster that we call a black hole. And all the information on that can be encoded on a two-dimensional plane, right? So there's the nature of things that exist related to gravity seem to actually be able to interact with different planes of, information,
You
like
know,
two-dimensional, third, fourth.
would be interesting? Black holes, because most people like think when they think of how black holes could potentially work and reason why they're so mysterious, they might usually they'll consider the possibility of there being another dimension that information is going into,
Yeah.
like
Oh, I've thought about that before.
um but what if black holes were a collapse of the third dimension?
Mm,
So it would
makes
as you
sense.
get closer and closer to the black hole, it becomes more and more two-dimensional space
Yeah.
until you hit two dimensions, and which is why everything looks like it stops when it hits the black hole
Mm.
because it goes from three dimensions to two, so there is no depth.
That would actually be pretty interesting, and it would make sense with the holographic principle for that to be the
Yeah,
case. It's definitely a valid theory. I think it's one that I don't know, I have to look more into that.
that would be fascinating.
Mhm.
Huh. I kind of just want to think about that for like
I
a
think it
while.
I think it lines up. Now, I'm curious as to why we wouldn't perceive it in 3 dimensions, or why we would perceive it in 3 dimensions. Is it necessary to have the mathematical structure of something that exists within space time in its 4 dimensions
Well, even if it was a
to the
collapse,
observer?
so consider a hole through paper, right?
Mhm.
That's a collapse of 2 dimensions right there that's happening. And the within but from a 2D perspective, you could still view that. You could still view its circumference um and walk around it and whatnot. Um, but it in essence is a collapse of its two-dimensional form.
Yeah.
And so if we imagine what that would look like in a three-dimensional setting, that would look like for us, that would look like a sphere.
Okay.
But it's essentially it's not a fourth dimension necessarily in and of itself. It's a collapse of the third
Almost like a,
dimension.
a continuous collapse of all the information that's being sucked into the black hole. And so you have this constant state of progressing towards 2 dimensions without it ever getting there. Maybe
Mm,
like if you think of something like the black hole death in the future in like hundreds of billions and trillions of years, everything goes within the black
yeah,
holes.
and we'll think
And then
about
it
what would
dissipates.
happen.
Nothing exists further. It's two
Exactly,
dimensional.
exactly. Like, what if nothing existed beyond that? Like, if it was a collapse of the three dimensions and there was not a fourth dimension, there's nothing.
Yeah.
Um, well, I mean, fourth dimension, there was time, I guess, classifies as fourth dimension, but
Yeah.
you know what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
The As that information got closer and closer to the three-dimensional collapse and breakdown, it would, from our perspective, would become slower and slower and slower and slower
Yeah.
until and if you think about that in context of the way that it would work in our from our three-dimensional existence, what happens when things accumulate? They get slower and slower and slower and slower. Like as they
Mhm.
approach that, it would get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in order to contain it,
Yeah.
And so in essence, from our perspective, things are being collected. And it's one of those weird things that's like, is it or is it not? Because it depends on time, but it's um
We really could just be observing the transition to a simpler state of information that might be exactly what's happening.
yeah, it could have been a rather than a four dimension four dimensions or of space or more
Mhm.
being the cause of the creation of our three-dimensional space. Rather than it going in that direction, it could have been the opposite direction where
Yeah.
where one or two dimensions became three dimensions.
Mhm. That would definitely be pretty strange. It seems to be that it's a lot more useful to try to explain different aspects of reality in lower dimensions than it is for higher dimensions. It's hard to explain high energy theoretical geometry, for example, in a way that actually makes sense. Oh, did it do it again? Come on, man.
So I don't know what he's doing.
Come on, Carl. Do better.
Freaking Carl.
Do you remember what I was saying?
You said it much easier to uh
Oh, yes, to understand what could be affected at like a lower dimensional scale than it is for like high energy theoretical geometry, with like
um,
multiple, like 6, 7 dimensions, even,
right.
you know?
Well, I mean, honestly though, to there are elements that make more sense for a three-dimensional space to evolve out of two-dimensional or lower level of dimensions
Mhm.
um, than it does for us to hypothesize about there being more dimensions than what we can
Oh,
observe.
for sure.
That said, I'm not sure if that two-dimensional space theory would hold up
Yeah.
as far as explaining other things that we can't explain in our three-dimensional space, such as uh, um, like dark matter and dark energy.
It's like we definitely exist in the world and universe that we perceive is in 3 dimensions.
Hmm.
It's not we don't just perceive and collapse all like infinite dimensions of reality into the third.
Right.
That's not what's
Right.
happening. We live in an actual third dimension universe. And a really important question is why? Why that's the case, you know? Because at first glance it seems rather arbitrary. Why weren't we created in fourth dimensions second? I mean, heck, it seems a lot easier to for a natural state of survival to be in 2 or 1 dimensions than it is 3. Why is 3 the sweet spot that
Hmm.
the universe picked for some reason?
Yeah, I think that's kind of where that maybe that simulation theory gained prominence was
Mhm.
the observation that we've made simulations that are 2D, um, and we are 3D
Yeah.
beings. Therefore, what if there was a 4D being that made us a 3D, us as a 3D simulation?
Yeah. Maybe, something that I'll entertain is it okay if we're going with simulation theory? Okay, I don't think that we were just an arbitrary simulation. I think that there's actually a top-down model of infinite dimensions with the infinite dimension us residing, simulating ourselves at different dimensional levels.
Hmm.
And so you have this hierarchy of experience throughout all the different dimensions that then translate into your integrative whole. That is the you that exists beyond space time and confinements. Yeah. Hmm.
All right.
I just came up with
Well,
that just now.
on that note, I think that's a good place for us to break,
All right. Sounds good.
and then we'll be back in about five
We'll be
minutes or
back.
so to go over phenylpiracetam
No
as
parasitam.
well as
You got
the
brain
gut
access.
brain
And what?
axis and gradient
Gradient
descent.
descent. Boop, boop.
It is going to be great,
Super awesome.
isn't it? That was a
Uh,
really terrible, terrible pun that I feel
we
very
might cut that one
apologetic
out.
for.
Or maybe not. Keep it in.
I I quote Jacques from Finding Nemo. I am ashamed.
Specifically from Finding Nemo.
All right. Well,